If one anonymous person can expose more secrets than every intelligence agency on Earth combined, then the problem isn't hacking, it's how much we've been taught not to look. In April 2016, a single leak did what protests, elections, and laws had failed to do for decades. It made the most powerful people on the planet afraid. Not accused, afraid. Within hours, prime ministers were scrambling, billionaires were calling lawyers, and governments were quietly activating damage control protocols they hoped they would never need. This wasn't a scandal. It was a system failure. Because what leaked wasn't a rumor or a theory, it was 11.5 million internal documents detailing how wealth, power, and corruption actually move through the modern world. Offshore companies, shell corporations, nominee directors, transactions routed through 4 countries in under 30 seconds, all designed to make ownership disappear. The myth we're sold is that the system is broken. The truth is, worse, the system is working exactly as designed to protect those at the top from accountability, while everyone else plays by rules they never helped write. And the most dangerous part isn't that this exists, it's that it operated in plain sight for 40 years, legal, normalized, invisible, because complexity kept people quiet and ignorance kept them obedient. Someone decided that silence was the real crime. They didn't ask for money, they didn't reveal their name, they pressed send. And when the lights came on, the question was no longer who is guilty, but how many leaders can survive the truth becoming public. Money doesn't disappear. It's trained, conditioned, taught how to move without being seen. Long before the first document leaked, a parallel financial system was already operating at full capacity, quiet, legal, and meticulously polished. Not in back alleys or secret vaults, but in climate-controlled offices where lawyers spoke softly and contracts looked ordinary. This system wasn't built by criminals. It was built by professionals. And that's what made it dangerous. At its core, the mechanism is simple enough to explain in minutes, yet complex enough to discourage questions. Register a company in a jurisdiction that promises secrecy. Install a nominee director, someone whose name appears on paper, but who holds no real power. Open a bank account under the company's identity. Then move the money. Once it passes through, that shell ownership dissolves, responsibility blurs. On the record, no one owns anything. Off the record, everything is controlled. This architecture wasn't illegal. It was optimized, designed to be defensible, deniable, and endlessly scalable. What began as a tool for corporate efficiency became a shield for anyone wealthy enough to afford it. Politicians used it to avoid scrutiny. Sanctioned individuals used it to move funds. Criminal networks used it to wash money clean, and the same paperwork covered all of them equally. One law firm didn't invent this system, but it perfected it. They turned discretion into a product and invisibility into a service. Thousands of companies were created not to build anything, sell anything, or employ anyone, but to exist just long enough to absorb money and pass it along. Week after week, year after year. 40 years of transactions quietly stacking on top of one another, forming a hidden infrastructure of global power. Inside the firm, emails reveal moments of hesitation. A compliance officer raises a concern. A partner acknowledges a client is obviously a crook. The transaction goes through anyway. Because stopping wasn't the business model. Movement was. The system didn't reward ethics, it rewarded silence. And for decades, that silence held. Until someone decided that the most dangerous crime wasn't what the system enabled, but how effectively it convinced the world not to look. At 12:47 a.m., when most of the world was asleep and the news cycle was safely quiet, a single message landed in a journalist's inbox. It didn't come with credentials. It didn't ask for trust. It offered no explanation. Just 3 words that carried more weight than any press release ever could, interested in data. In investigative journalism, messages like that are usually ignored or treated as traps. This one couldn't be, because what followed wasn't a tip, it was an avalanche. The first files arrived cautiously, almost as if testing whether the recipient would flinch. Passport scans, corporate registries, internal emails stamped with official letterheads, then spreadsheets, wire transfer authorizations, instructions to backdate documents. Each file alone looked bureaucratic, dull, harmless. Together they told a different story. A story of money learning how to erase its own fingerprints. Very quickly, the scale became undeniable. This wasn't a cache of documents. It was an archive measured in terabytes spanning nearly 40 years. Millions of records from dozens of countries written in multiple languages, riddled with contradictions and deliberate obfuscation. No index, no map, just raw exposure. The kind that doesn't just threaten reputations, it threatens systems. And then came the warning. Not a request for protection, not a demand, a statement. My life is in danger. That single line changed everything. This wasn't a source chasing recognition. This was someone who understood exactly what happens when you expose the wrong people too quickly. Evidence disappears, stories get buried, accidents happen. The truth doesn't survive long enough to matter. One journalist couldn't handle this. One newsroom couldn't verify it. Publishing alone would be professional suicide, and possibly worse. The only option was radical cooperation. What followed was unprecedented, a global alliance of reporters operating in total secrecy, bound by silence and trust. No leaks, no spouses, no governments. Everything encrypted. Every access logged. Names replaced with codes. Some subjects were so powerful that journalists refused to type them at all. This wasn't reporting as usual. It was an operation conducted under the assumption that every move was being watched, that phones could be compromised, that inboxes weren't safe, that time itself was an enemy. Because the longer the truth stayed hidden, the more likely it was to be neutralized. The files kept coming, night after night, millions of pieces of a puzzle no one had ever tried to assemble before. And as the picture slowly began to form, one reality became impossible to ignore. Once this story was published, there would be no going back. The question was no longer if the world would change, but whether the people exposing it would survive long enough to see it happen. Money moves fast, but it is never truly invisible. It leaves traces, patterns so subtle they only appear when millions of documents are placed side by side. Once the data was structured and searchable, the chaos began to organize itself. Names repeated, addresses echoed across jurisdictions. The same nominee directors surfaced again and again, signing documents for companies they would never control, for clients they would never meet. What initially looked like random noise slowly revealed an architecture of intent. This was not about single-shell companies. It was about chains. One company owned another, which owned a trust, which controlled a foundation registered in different countries, each step adding distance between money and accountability. Following ownership meant crossing borders in seconds: Panama to the British Virgin Islands, Luxembourg, to Hong Kong, Geneva, to Singapore. Jurisdictions stitched together by wire transfers that moved faster than regulators could think. The system wasn't chaotic. It was elegant, designed to exhaust anyone trying to understand it. And then the names began to surface, not directly, never directly, but close enough to feel deliberate. A celebrated musician suddenly connected to transactions totaling billions of US dollars. A politician's spouse quietly holding financial claims against banks the politician was publicly regulating. Children and cousins listed as shareholders of companies owning luxury real estate, private jets, and investment funds. Power had learned a simple lesson long ago: never put your own hands on the money. Every discovery triggered the same reaction inside the investigation: slow down, verify everything. In this world, suspicion wasn't enough. Each claim had to survive legal scrutiny. Signatures were matched against public records. Bank transfers were cross-referenced with timestamps. Corporate filings were compared across registries to expose inconsistencies that no lawyer could explain away. A single mistake could collapse the entire case and discredit months of work. In Iceland, the truth didn't hinge on criminality. It hinged on trust. While the country was still reeling from a catastrophic banking collapse, the Prime Minister's household quietly held millions of dollars in claims against failed banks, banks he had promised voters he would hold accountable. It wasn't illegal. It was undisclosed. And that omission changed everything. Because leadership depends not only on law, but on legitimacy. Elsewhere, the stakes were even higher. Offshore entities used to bypass international sanctions. Companies designed to move money for individuals barred from global financial systems. Structures so opaque they allowed wealth to flow freely, while consequences remained trapped on paper. This wasn't about greed alone. It was about insulation, an entire ecosystem built to protect power from exposure. As the investigators stepped back and looked at the full map, one realization cut through the room. These weren't isolated abuses of a flawed system. This was the system, a parallel economy designed to serve those who could afford secrecy while everyone else lived under rules enforced in plain sight. And once that truth became visible, the question shifted from who was involved to something far more dangerous. What happens when the public finally sees how power really protects itself? April 3rd, 2016. The clock hits 8:00 p.m. Eastern Time. There is no dramatic announcement, no countdown on television screens, no warning shot. The story simply appears everywhere at once. 109 media outlets publish in unison across continents, across languages, across political lines. In that instant, secrecy stops being a private asset and becomes a public liability. The internet doesn't react slowly, it convulses. Within minutes, social platforms flood with screenshots and headlines. Newsroom servers buckle under traffic measured in millions of page views per hour. Search engines spike so fast they can't keep up. At the Panamanian law firm at the center of the storm, phones ring endlessly and go unanswered. Employees have already left the building. The quiet feels intentional, almost rehearsed, as if everyone understands that staying would mean becoming part of the evidence. On the streets of Reykjavik, the reaction is immediate and physical. Crowds gather outside Parliament, swelling by the hour. Pots bang together. Voices overlap. Eggs arc through the air and explode against windows. This isn't random anger, it's recognition. Citizens realize that while they were absorbing the consequences of financial collapse, those in charge had quietly insulated themselves from it. By the end of the night, the Prime Minister has vanished from public view. Across Europe, the shock spreads. In London, a Prime Minister hesitates on live television, caught between legal explanations and moral outrage. In Madrid, a cabinet minister resigns rather than attempt denial. In Islamabad, court petitions are filed almost immediately, transforming journalism into judicial momentum. The leak doesn't just expose, it activates. Authoritarian states respond differently. In Moscow, officials dismiss the revelations as a foreign intelligence operation, attacking the messengers instead of addressing the evidence. State television avoids the details entirely. In Beijing, the reaction is surgical. Mentions disappear mid-refresh. Search results return nothing. Entire articles blink out of existence. The silence is louder than any denial. It confirms the story's reach and its threat. What truly changes the equation isn't public outrage. It's institutional panic. Tax authorities open investigations. Prosecutors seek warrants. Financial crime units move into offices once considered untouchable. Within days, more than 30 governments announce probes. Not because they all suddenly discovered ethics, but because ignoring the revelations is no longer politically survivable. The leak has crossed a point of no return. What was once whispered behind closed doors is now archived, searchable, and shared globally. The system depended on discretion, delay, and disbelief. On this night, all three collapse at once. And as the first resignations roll in, one truth becomes unavoidable. Once secrecy dies and public power has no place left to hide. After the noise fades, after the headlines thin out and the crowds go home, what remains is not closure, but consequence. Governments announce recovered funds, measured in billions of US dollars. New laws pass that had stalled for years, suddenly pushed through by public pressure that lawmakers can no longer ignore. Terms once buried in regulatory jargon, beneficial ownership, transparency, disclosure, enter mainstream conversation. For the first time, the architecture of offshore secrecy is no longer abstract. It has faces, names, documents. The law firm at the center of the leak does not fall in a dramatic courtroom verdict. It collapses quietly. Clients disappear. Revenue evaporates. The product it sold, trust, becomes impossible to restore. Its founders insist they broke no laws, and in narrow legal terms they may be right. But legality was never the real issue. Legitimacy was. And once that's gone, no compliance memo can bring it back. Yet the system itself does not die. It adapts. Money reroutes. New jurisdictions rise. Old loopholes are replaced with more sophisticated ones. The offshore world has always been fluid, always one step ahead of regulation. Exposure wounds it, but does not destroy it. The game continues, refined by the lessons of failure. What cannot be reversed is awareness. Before this moment, offshore finance lived in footnotes and technical briefings. After it, the public understands something fundamental: inequality is not an accident of talent or effort alone. It is engineered, maintained through complexity, protected by silence. Once people see how easily wealth escapes responsibility, the mythology of a fair system begins to fracture. Months later, the anonymous source releases a short manifesto. No name, no location, no claim to heroism, just a reason. The system is rigged, not against one country or one ideology, but against anyone without access to secrecy. They never asked for money, never sought recognition. Their power came from restraint and timing. The lasting impact of the leak is not the number of prosecutions or resignations. It is the shift in the cost of hiding. Secrecy used to feel permanent. Now it feels fragile, conditional, temporary. And that changes behavior in ways no regulation ever could. The final question is not whether another leak will come. History suggests it will. The real question is whether the world will respond differently next time, or whether silence once again will prove too comfortable to resist. This story isn't really about offshore accounts, shell companies, or leaked files. It's about what happens when complexity is used to silence accountability, and how easily power survives when no one is watching closely enough. The Panama Papers didn't prove that corruption exists. We already knew that. They proved something more uncomfortable: that the system protecting it was legal, normalized, and built into the modern world we participate in every day. One person didn't bring that system down, but one person proved it could be exposed. And once exposed, it could never return to the shadows unchanged. The lesson isn't that transparency fixes everything. It's that silence guarantees nothing ever changes. If this investigation made you see power differently, take a moment to acknowledge it. If you believe more people should understand how these systems work, share this story. And if you want more deep investigations like this, calm, factual, and uncompromising, subscribe. Because attention is the one thing secrecy can't survive.